Happy Friday, everybody. Hope we're all enjoying the Outlaws of Thunder Junction. And this Monday, I went over and did a meta review for the best performing decks in Best of 3 and in Best of 1, which is something I do every Monday. We had 4 top 3 finishes in the standard challenges that were all Esper Midrange. So I figured it was about time to redo the Esper Midrange Best of 3 Sideboard guide with some of the new data that we have from the previous set. So this is the first place winner from the standard challenge that happened on April 20th. And there are going to be some cards that are not available yet in the data. So Tiny Bones, the Pickpocket, and such, right? The Duelist of the Mind, right? So take it with a grain of salt. Again, this is something that I hope will help you better understand the archetype and have insights for both beginners who don't know how to sideboard in the first place, to veterans who are really trying to understand the archetype at a deep level and prepare for an RCQ or a tournament. So with that in mind, the deck is, so we're going to be going over pretty much the standard shell for Esper Midrange. And just so, I would show you all the sideboard, but right now it's glitched in Arena. So if you want the full deck list, I will put it in the video description. And with that, let's get started. All right, so here is take 2 of the Esper Midrange Best of 3 Sideboard Guide using the data that we have from Murders at Karlov Manor. And again, I did this because I was kind of upset with the options that were available. So take this with a grain of salt. Again, this is for your information. For example, there was Cut Down against Domain, and I got a lot of feedback. I guess not a lot of feedback. I got some feedback about how it's a dead card. And if you want to take out Cut Down, that's great. Why I'm doing this is to try to give a unbiased approach of what the data is suggesting, and it does come with some flaws. Sometimes the data suggests stuff that's wrong. So keep that in mind, that this is not written in stone. This is something that is just for your benefit. And with that, let's get started. So what I like to do is I like to use a tracker called Untapped, which tracks Magic the Gathering data. I had a question about the win percentage and if it was games played or games in hand or just included in the deck, and it's a really good question, and I do believe that it's games played. That way the tracker can also take data from your opponent, but I'll try to look into that and get a more definite answer for future sideboard guides. But anyway, so it allows us to look at how the deck has been performing. And then what I like to do is I like to look at MTG Goldfish, which is a website that tracks Magic the Gathering tournament data. And so this will be the top 8 most common matchups as of week 1 of Outlaws at Thunder Junction. So number 1 on the list, the most common one in the tournament scene right now, is Dimir Midrange. And so top of the list here, we can see Tishana's Tidebinder. And so we should be bringing in the 1 copy of Tishana's Tidebinder from the main. And then our weakest card is No More Lies. And then it gets into, well, I mean, Gix's Command is weaker, but it's in the sideboard. And then it gets into a low data issue where there's not enough data. And so one of the things that we can do to kind of look at alternative lists, see if there are cards that should be included that aren't being included. And we do see a couple of cards. So Make Disappear, it's kind of like No More Lies, but it doesn't require 2 mana, so it doesn't require a blue and a white. So you can a little bit more consistently get this off on turn 2, which is going to matter in this archetype because Dimir Midrange is relatively quick. So if you're stumbling on your mana and you can't cast your No More Lies, Make Disappear would actually work as a better option, at least according to the data. And then this list decided to take out the 3 copies of the Wandering Emperor. So if you are running your own Esper Midrange deck, you may be including Wandering Emperor, and it's a good one to include against Dimir Midrange. And then as far as the other thing that I like to do is look at all archetypes. So you can look at the list that you can change it to include data from all archetypes instead of just from Dimir Midrange. And what this allows me to do is kind of look how the card is performing overall. And you got to take this all category with a grain of salt. because sometimes you'll have a card that comes in that's really good in a different deck and is kind of being carried by the other deck's matchup. So I tend to lean more heavily on the Dimir midrange specific data first, and then all archetypes just as kind of make sure I didn't miss anything. And so we can see here that there's nothing that's really popping out, except for we can see that No More Lies is also pretty weak in overall as well. And then Dimir midrange. So the I think the sideboard. Here's the data suggested sideboard would be to bring in Tishana's Tidebinder, one copy of Acklazot's Deepest Betrayal, cut one copy of No More Lies, and cut one copy of Lord Skitter, Sewer King. Notably, the missing options are Make Disappear and Wandering Emperor if you're trying to look for additional sideboard options to bring in against Dimir. And the Tishana's Tidebinder is pretty good at protecting your hand from things like Deep Cavern Bat. You can use it to silence Gix to prevent their card draw. You can also hit Shieldred to make it so that it's no longer deals 2 damage every time you draw a card and gains them life. So pretty useful tool to have against Dimir midrange. And I think that's really why we saw a lot of Tishana's Tidebinder being brought in all 3 copies of the Esper midrange that I covered on Monday. Is because Dimir midrange was an anticipated matchup. Acklazot's Deepest Betrayal is also good at stabilizing against the mono red matchup and the Dimir midrange matchup if you can make it to turn 5. So the lifelink from it can be a really stabilizing force if you can prevent, the strategy is to slow their onslaught down enough to survive to playing Acklazots, who can then re-stabilize you. And it's a very difficult threat for them to deal with, because if they do use something like Go for the Throat, it does have the ability to come back. And then it also gives us 1/1 flying bat creature tokens with flying that are able to block the Dimir midrange. Tends to try to push a lot of pressure through the air, through Deep Cavern Bat and Spyglass Siren and such. So the 1/1 flying tokens are actually relevant. And then No More Lies can be handy. It's not like it's a completely useless card. Remember, Make Disappear was one of the really good alternatives, but it doesn't help you get your removal back from like Deep Cavern Bat. And unless this lines up perfectly to hit Gix is really your #1 target to try to counterspell. And again, that's why the 1 in a blue is easier to do to line it up early than No More Lies, which requires the white and the blue. So and it also depends. There is play versus draw, which if you're going to get really into Magic the Gathering, one of the things that the data does not capture is whether or not the card is good, depending on if you're going first or second. And so things like counter spells like No More Lies tend to be better when you're on the draw, because then you're spending 2 mana to prevent their 3 free drop. So just something to keep in mind if you're going deep into the archetype. The other thing too, the Lord Skitter is pretty bad in this matchup as well. Just the 3/3 body for 3 isn't particularly strong. And then so you could also go with just cutting the 2 copies of Lord Skitter if you want to keep the No More Lies. Again, this isn't something that I want to be written in stone. This is just something these are suggestions, guidelines. Next up on the list, the second most common archetype was Esper Midrange, and Fairy Mastermind is pretty strong against Esper Midrange because of being able to draw at least 1 card whenever they connive off of cards like Rafine. And then as our weakest card here is No More Lies. It is a little bit low on the side of data, though. A good chunk of the deck is not available. However, we can look at alternatives and see if there are some missing options, and we do see some classics against Esper Midrange, so like Destroy Evil. Now, there is a lot, all 3 decks dropped 4 copies of Wedding Announcement, which is something that we want to kind of look for throughout this review of the data, is how commonly is Wedding Announcement being a top performing card. And so Destroy Evil was brought in because it's good against Wedding Announcement and Virtue of Loyalty. And so if there's less enchantments, this might not be as good of a sideboard option. So something to keep in mind, that as we get more, when we revisit this again, it may not be as good of a option. And we will see some changes if you go back and look at my old Esper Midrange guide, which was based off of the data that we had from Lost Caverns of Ixalan. It's interesting to see how the sideboard strategies change over time, or at least what the data would suggest. So, but another missing option here is the Wandering Emperor again, and Wedding Announcement does make it into the top 10 for Esper Midrange specifically. And then all archetypes. This one, we've got Aclazot's Deepest Betrayal just right under Cutdown, so I think we should bring in the second copy of Aclazot's Deepest Betrayal. And then Gix's Command is also on this list, so I think we should bring in the 2 copies of Gix's Command. And then Negate is also positive in this matchup, but barely. But I do think it's enough to consider bringing it in, and I'll talk about it in just a second about why. Lord Skitter is not particularly good in this matchup. Tishana's Tidebinder is not particularly good as well, and then the 2 copies of Dinnik we could also take out. And so this is why I do look at the all archetypes, is that when the data is low in the archetype specifically, then you can kind of use the all archetypes to guide you. So I hope you agree with my interpretations. But so if we bring in the 1 copy of Aclazot's Deepest Betrayal and the 2 copies of Gix's Command, we can cut the 2 copies of Lord Skitter, Sewer King, and Tishana's Tidebinder. Notably, Destroy Evil, the Wandering Emperor, and Wedding Announcement are missing from this list. And then Aclazot's Deepest Betrayal is a nice recurring threat against their removal. Esper Midrange, you basically just have to dodge it getting exiled from No More Lies, and then they can have a kind of a difficult time dealing with the recurring threat. Gix's Command, on the other hand, can reset a board that has gotten out of hand from Rafine. It's nice to be able to kind of have a reset button, and Gix's Command helps you do that, as well as being able to give you lifelink if you are trading blows, which can happen in this archetype. And then Lord Skitter can remove Dinnik from their graveyard. That is pretty much the one target that you've got again in Esper Midrange. The one issue with Lord Skitter is that it has to survive, and Esper Midrange has plenty of spot removal or interaction to prevent that. So Tishana's Tidebinder can hit Rafine and can just make it into a 1/4. However, you do have to pay the ward, so it's a turn 4 play, and Esper Midrange can have some spicy starts. So it might be a little bit too slow. And then we also want to be removing their board instead of leaving a 1/4 body, which can end up stopping a fair amount of our aggression if we're going to be pumping like Dinnik, for example. And so really in this matchup, what you're trying to do is get something to stick on the board, right? And so the Tishana's Tidebinder doesn't really help you with that battle. Next up, we have Boros Convoke, and we've got 2 Gix's Command top of the list here, so we should definitely be bringing that in. We've got Tishana's Tidebinder, which is negative. It is a difficult matchup. Boros Convoke is an unfavorable matchup, but as you will see here, the pilot of this deck definitely anticipated coming up against Boros Convoke and has quite an extensive sideboard strategy or option that is supported by the data. So as far as the weaker performing cards go, we've got Go for the Throat and Fairy Mastermind near the bottom, as well as Lord Skitter and Aclazot's Deepest Betrayal. As far as alternatives go, we do have a couple of missing options. So Lauren of the Third Path was a popular one to bring in against the enchantment removal. So if you go back and you look at the Esper Midrange sideboard guide from months ago, it's good against, it was good against Domain for hitting things like Up the Beanstalk. And really the most enchantment heavy deck, especially since Esper Midrange is dropping the Wedding Announcements, is Boros Convoke, because it's running Case of the Gateway Express and War Leader's Call. So or if you are deciding to run Lauren of the Third Path, it would be a good one to bring in for Boros Convoke. Another one that's missing, that's some decks include, some don't, is Preacher of the Schism. And so this one can kind of help, especially with the 1/1 token production, can kind of help stay, go wide enough to prevent Boros Convoke from just completely overrunning you. Some other ones that are included on the list here are Lasav, Wearer of Faces, and that one just really the 2/3 body. And then, being able to copy something like Imidane's Recruiter is less interesting because the copy doesn't trigger an ETB, right? So, but the clue token production still gives you some card draw later if you do survive the onslaught. And destroy evil, again, there's a fair amount of enchantments that are good targets in this archetype. And then long goodbye is one that we've been seeing explored in some sideboards, and having the spot removal at instant speed to be able to destroy 3 or less, it does hit Imidane's Recruiter. Then, as far as all archetypes go here, we can see the classic anti-mono red card, Knockout Blow. And there are enough red cards in, like, if you are attacking, if you're targeting Imidane's Recruiter, then it does cost only 1, deal 4 damage, and gain you 2 life. So, but you can also just cast it for 3 and hit their Knight Errant of Eos. So Knockout Blow is actually a pretty good card to bring in as a sideboard option against Boros Convoke. Then we also see the other classic sideboard option, which is Temporary Lockdown, so we should be bringing in the 2 copies there as well. And then nothing really of note further down the list. But I did want to include it just in case it was relevant to you. Just because it's not relevant to this build specifically, there are many builds of Esper Midrange out there. So the data suggested sideboard here is to bring in the 2 copies of Gix's Command, the 1 copy of Tishana's Tidebinder, the 3 copies of Knockout Blow, and the 2 copies of Temporary Lockdown. So we're looking at an 8-card sideboard, which is pretty extensive. And so we're going to drop the 3 copies of Go for the Throat, 2 copies of Fairy Mastermind, 2 copies of Lord Skitter, Sewer King, and 1 copy of Acklazot's Deepest Betrayal. Again, the missing options are Lauren of the Third Path, Preacher of the Schism, Lasav, Wearer of Faces, Destroy Evil, and Long Goodbye, if you are looking to include more hate against Boros Convoke. So Gix's Command resets the board, and Boros Convoke is pretty good at rebuilding from a Wrath, but it does potentially also give us some much needed life gain, and or it can be used to get rid of a big threat like a Knight Errant of Eos or a Warden of the Inner Sky that has gotten out of control. Tishana's Tidebinder can hit Knight Errant of Eos or Imidane's Recruiter, and is kind of a classic option in blue to be bringing in against Boros Convoke, whereas the Knockout Blow is typically sideboarded in against mono red, but it can be used, as I mentioned, to target Imidane's Recruiter, and lines up fairly well against Knight Errant of Eos. Temporary Lockdown is the sideboard of choice against Boros Convoke, and we've seen it range from 2 copies to 4. I think the most common that I've seen is deciding to do 2 Temporary Lockdowns, just because it's not necessarily the end-all be-all if you do hit it against Boros Convoke. Again, they're pretty good at rebuilding against the Wrath, but it's a good way to do it. Another thing too that we've seen is people cutting the Temporary Lockdowns and replacing them with copies of Pest Control, as long as you're in white-black. And so as time goes on, we'll see if Pest Control might actually end up replacing Temporary Lockdown in the sideboard options. And then we've got Go for the Throat. Spot removal doesn't work terribly well against Boros Convoke. You'd much rather be just doing cut downs if you are going to be doing the spot removal. Especially since if you need to use 2 mana, then you're kind of trading down in mana value if you're targeting something like a beefed up Warden of the Inner Sky. So we can bring those out. And then Boros Convoke isn't drawing any cards, and the small body of Fairy Mastermind isn't really going to help us survive until we hit a board wipe, which is the number 1 priority. Similarly, the Lord Skitter Sewer King, the 3/3 for 3, is not a, standard is a pretty powerful format. 3/3s for 3 used to be kind of the norm for your Centaur coursers and whatnot, right? It's just no longer the case, right? So Lord Skitter is understated for a 3-drop, and the 1/1s can't block, so it doesn't help you with the go wide strategy or counter the go wide strategy of Boros Convoke. And there are some cards like Yoshin Frontliner and Lunarch Veteran that kind of come and go from the Boros Convoke list. So there is some stuff that you could target from the graveyard, but not really enough to justify the low stat block. And then Acklazot's Deepest Betrayal is too slow for Boros Convoke. Usually by turn 4 or their turn 5, they've already hit into their Imidane's Recruiter, and then so the 4/4 lifelink isn't really helping you stabilize as much as hitting into a Wrath. So next up on the list is Mono Red Aggro, and we definitely saw a spike in Mono Red Aggro. Mogged was able to take down the standard challenge 64 in the last week of Murders at Carlisle Manor, and so I think there's some renewed interest in mono red aggro, especially with the tools that were available with like the Slick Shot, the 1/2 Prowess Flyer with haste a lot. And so I think there's some renewed interest in mono red aggro, and so this week I think it's number 4. And then, so anyway, this one we can see Aclazot's Deepest Betrayal making it in here at the bottom of the list. Really, our only sideboard option. And then, as far as the weakest cards go, Deep Cavern Bat is probably worth removing, as well as the 1 copy of Tishana's Tidebinder. As far as alternative strategies go, there are some missing options. So, Long Goodbye, it's pretty. Spot removal is good for removing Godric and Squee. Cryptic Coat, which I thought was an interesting one, because usually I think of Cryptic Coat as a card that's good against control, but Cryptic Coat has Ward, and so it's actually harder for mono red to deal with the 3/2 body, and then later in the game you can continue to bring it back as a blocker. So might actually be better in mono red aggro than anticipated. At least caught me off guard. And then Lasav, where faces, again, this is another one similar to Dimir, where the 2/3 body just lines up nicely. And then being able to copy, like, at least if you copy into Squee, it does a little bit more than it does in Dimir, where you can use this to remove Squee from their graveyard so they can't bring it back. And then if you're attacking with it, like, well, the copy might happen after it's already attacked, so I'm not sure you get the 1/1, but it's still useful to have a little bit of graveyard hate, is what I'm trying to get at. And then, as far as all archetypes go, the Gix's Command is top of the list here. So this is something that happens when you're looking at Esper Midrange specifically. The data for Gix's Command contradicts what it is for all archetypes. And this is likely because of mono black being quite a favorable matchup against mono red. So take this, what I tend to do is lean towards the archetype specific data instead of all archetypes. If you don't like the contradicting data, then what you can always do is, you take out a different card than Gix's Command if there's some contradiction. But the other thing to consider here are the 3 knockout blows, classic sideboard tech against mono red. And then another one that comes in near the bottom of the list that could be considered, and I know some people do like to sideboard it in against mono red, is Duress. Because there are a fair amount of spells that mono red is running, Duress can get rid of the lightning strikes and play with fires and such. So I've decided not to bring it in, but if you wanted to, I wouldn't blame you. So top of the list here, we've got the 3 knockout blows. Aclazot's Deepest Betrayal, similar to like Dimir, is good if we can stall into hitting our 5, and then it can help stabilize and seal out the game. Deep Cavern Bat, and then Tishana's Tidebinder looking like the weakest options. Again, the missing options are Long Goodbye, Cryptic Coat, Lasav, Wearer of Faces. The knockout blow, costing 1 mana to deal 4 damage and gain 2 life, is why it is the sideboard option against mono red if you have access to white. And then Aclazot's helps us stabilize if we can survive to 5 mana. Deep Cavern Bat is great if your opponents are trying to get away with running a low number of spot removal, but mono red is not trying to do that, and not by any means. They have plenty of ways of removing the bat, and then the 1/1 stat block for 2 just really doesn't help slow their pressure. The lifelink can help stabilize, but again, I think this is the data suggests that this is a card worth taking out. And then Tishana's Tidebinder, again, similarly has weak stats as a 3/2 for 3, and doesn't really help us survive to hitting our Aclazots. Next up on the list is Temur Rage Control, the World Souls Rage deck. And so in this matchup, Tishana's Tidebinder is our best card and should definitely be brought in from the sideboard. The deck is not drawing terribly well, so Fairy Mastermind could be taken out. And then 3 copies of No More Lies could also be taken out as an option, because Temur Control has so much mana. And then low data into alternatives, and we do see, again, Make Disappear coming up as an option that might be better than No More Lies. And again, because you have a easier time casting it on turn 2, where you're trying to hit something like a Shigeki or an Aftermath Analyst to slow their loop down. Another one that's would be okay in this matchup is the Wandering Emperor. although not a particularly good one at 41%, did make it into the top 10, and this is a difficult matchup for Esper Midrange. And as far as all archetypes go, we can see Negate at the top of the list, which makes a lot of sense. You can hit their Virtue of Strength, you can hit their World Soul's Rage, and then 2 copies of Temporary Lockdown, which is also useful for hitting Shigeki and the Aftermath Analyst. As far as the worst cards go, as far as the sideboard goes, the Tishana's Tidebinder should be brought in, 2 Negates and 2 Temporary Lockdowns, and then we can cut the 2 copies of Fairy Mastermind and the 3 copies of No More Lies. Missing options are Make Disappear and the Wandering Emperor. So Tishana's Tidebinder can be played in response to your opponent sacrificing Aftermath Analyst, and it's absolutely devastating because they spend 4 mana to sacrifice their creature, and then you're like, nope, that didn't happen. And it just gets rid of the trigger, and then because the creature's already sacrificed, it's gone, right? So this is a perfect response to stopping at least part of their loop. Negate can be played either on Virtue of Strength or on World Soul's Rage. Kind of depends on how the match is going. If they get to the Virtue of Strength, the next turn is likely to be a World Soul's Rage, and you can plan on counterspelling the World Soul's Rage. The problem is that once they get to a bazillion mana, they can just Memory Deluge and find another one. So some matches you are going to want to be looking to disrupt their Virtue of Strength instead. And then Temporary Lockdown is one that they're not running as much of a there's no board flood strategy going on, but being able to hit Shigeki or Aftermath Analyst if your opponent does play into it early. So one of the things that you may have experienced if you play the World Soul's Rage deck is whether or not you play the Aftermath Analyst on turn 2, so that on turn 4 you can start doing the loop, or holding it until turn 6 where you can play it and immediately do it. So Temporary Lockdown punishes the players who are going to be playing out the Aftermath Analyst on turn 2, trying to hit it on turn 4. So if you're playing the World Soul's Rage deck, keep that in mind against white, that you may want to hold on to your Aftermath Analyst until later, where you can immediately get value out of it. So one thing to note too is that the Temporary Lockdowns should probably be substituted for Rest in Peace in this matchup. But again, the data for the substitution from Outlaws at Thunder Junction is not available yet. So that's something to keep in mind, that the Graveyard Hate sideboard specific card should probably be brought in this matchup. And then as far as the weaker cards go, Fairy Mastermind doesn't draw, so it relies on Memory Deluge for its dig. I guess outside of, there is Ill-Timed Explosion, which draws 2 cards. So, but if you're not going to be flashing this in to have it then get wrathed, right? So you're not really going to get a lot of card advantage off of the Fairy Mastermind. And once your opponent has 30,000 mana from Virtue of Strength and all of their crazy graveyard sacrifice loops, No More Lies becomes quickly a dead card, so we can cut all 3 copies there. Versus Domain, Fairy Mastermind does help us draw whenever they draw off of Up the Beanstalk, and so I'm not super surprised to see that at the top of the list. Domain also struggles a little bit against flyers, so we've got like Deep Cavern Bat is on there as well, especially the early flyers, because they have to use something like Leyline of Binding, unless they're running the more black-heavy removal with Virtue of Persistence and Go for the Throat or Long Goodbye. It can be kind of difficult for them to stop this, especially, their Topiary Stompers and Invasion of Zendikar can clog up the ground, but the air stays relatively open. Then at the bottom here, we've got 2 copies of No More Lies, or the bottom of the list, we've got No More Lies. Sorry, sometimes I get a little stumble over my words, so forgive me for not having the A+ production value, but I hope it's still useful. And then we hit into No Data. And alternative lists, nothing here popping out. Everything that's good against Domain is already in, and Domain was piloted by Reed Duke in the World Championship, and part of the reason why they selected Domain was that because it was a good matchup against Esper Midrange. So there's not a whole lot of options for Esper Midrange to counter what Domain is doing. Our best hope is Temporary Lockdown, Negate, and Prayer. So we'll see. Some people do like to include the Duress again, this is one that I'm not terribly impressed with duress in the sideboard after looking at through this data. So, but if you know, some people do bring in the duress to try to have a Hail Mary answer to taking out a Sunfall. So again, this is one that like cut down. Some people consider cut down to be an absolutely dead card in Domain, and you could just take out all of the copies of cut down, and it's fine. I do think there are some interesting lines that do involve cut down, so it's not entirely useless. Again, what I'm really trying to focus on and capture in this sideboard guide is what is going to help the majority of the deck. There are always going to be fine tunements that you can do in response to like whether or not you're on the play or versus the draw, what you're anticipating your opponent to sideboard into as well. So, I mean, sideboard guides can get particularly deep, and somebody who has, more practice with the deck specifically would be able to tell you a little bit more in depth about what's going on there. And you could probably cut down or some marginal improvements. However, I don't think it's going to be a dramatic effect on the archetype's win rate. That's just my opinion. So the sideboard strategy here, I think, is to bring in the 2 copies of Negate and the 2 copies of Temporary Lockdown. Cut the 3 copies of No More Lies and cut 1 copy of Cut Down. Oh, before I move on, I just wanted to make a note too so there's some interesting things that so notably Tishana's Tidebinder didn't make it on the list like we saw in the previous Esper Midrange Sideboard guide, and neither did Lauren of the Third Path. And I think this really reflects some of the changes that we've seen throughout the 2 months since I've done this. And so for example, like Lauren of the Third Path, not some domain lists are deciding to cut up the beanstalk or cut down on up the beanstalk. So Lauren of the Third Path has less good targets to hit. During Lost Caverns of Ixalan, Virtue of Persistence was being explored and was a decent target to hit as a 7-cost black enchantment. So as we see kind of the archetype change, it's also interesting to see that is reflected in the data as well. And then the fact that Tishana's Tidebinder is not in here, I think, points to the fact that it could be an artifact from, or it could be an issue with the data, right? Because Domain is a less common matchup now that the hype from the World Championship has died down a little bit. So we do have a smaller sample size in data, but I think it points that answering Atraxa specifically is not as important as answering Herd Migration as the #1 priority. So instead, we're going to be focusing on bringing in Negate and trying to protect our board from a Sunfall or hit Herd Migration. And then Temporary Lockdown is pretty good at answering, is being played in response to them playing Herd Migration to remove all of the 3/3 tokens. And then as far as the weaker cards go, Domain can get pretty high up in land counts. They play a large amount of lands, and so it's not uncommon for No More Lies to become somewhat of a dead card. And then it also has the issue of Cavern of Souls being able to choose Angel and then make it so that you can't counterspell Atraxa or Archangel of Wrath anyway. So No More Lies, I think, is a decent one to pull out here. And then again, I'm going to go with cutting out 1 copy of Cut Down. And Cut Down has no targets in Domain outside of the rare occurrence of bumping into Courier's Briefcase. However, you can do silly lines like shoot your own Dinnick to get it into the graveyard so that you can flash it back as a 3/2 flyer that Domain actually struggles with. And then that way so it doesn't get stuck, right? And so I think, things like that make me a little bit interested in keeping it, even though I think a lot of people consider Cut Down to just be absolutely something you take out in Domain. So if you want to take out all 3 copies, by all means, please do. This again is just information for you to utilize as you see fit. And then Bant Toxic or Bant Poison has made a resurgence on the best of 3 tournament scene. And top of the list here, we've got Cut Down. This list decided to take the 4th copy of Cut Down out of the sideboard. If you are running a sideboard that has Cut Down in it, the 4th copy, this is one where you would definitely want to bring it in. And then our next hope is Virtue of Loyalty, which gives us an instant speed blocker early on, which is very important for this archetype, and being able to snag something, one of their 1/1 attackers with toxic that they weren't anticipating you having a blocker for, can be what helps swing this very unfavorable matchup into more of a winnable range. And then the fact that later the Virtue of Loyalty also gives our creatures a pseudo vigilance by untapping them after we attack, allows us to attack in while also being able to protect against the toxic threats. And here at the bottom of the list is No More Lies. And then we hit into No Data. As far as alternative strategies go, again, nothing in particular being brought in that we're missing. No options there. And as far as all archetypes go, Gix's Command is top of the list here, so we should probably bring in the 2 copies of Gix's Command. And then notably the Temporary Lockdown, which kind of used to be the go-to sideboard against Bant Poison, hasn't been performing as well, since we've seen Bant Poison bring in higher costed cards specifically to answer Temporary Lockdown, like Annex Sentry and Bloated Contaminator. So, Oh, sorry, my notes are wrong here. So for Bant Poison, we can bring in the 2 copies of Gix's Command as well as the 2 copies of No More Lies. And again, the missing options are none. So because of it, Bant Toxic basically disappeared from the best of 3 scene. So the designer of this deck was probably not anticipating Bant Toxic. And you can kind of see a trend that's occurring with the most popular matchups with like Dimir Midrange and such, having more of a strategy that then kind of diminishes as we get down to the less likely to occur in the best of 3 tournament scene, at least on the for the standard challenge. So if you are trying to prepare this deck for ladder climbing, you may want to tweak it a little bit to reflect the matches that you are experiencing on the ladder. So just something to keep in mind, that this was designed for a tournament with a very specific set of needs. But anyway, Gix's Command is our answer to wiping their board, even if they have played Venerated Rot Priest, because it doesn't target anything. And then it also is able to get the Bloated Contaminators off of the board if that the Temporary Lockdowns don't. The trick, though, is once again surviving until turn 5. And then the 2 copies of No More Lies we can pull out. It's another matchup where No More Lies is just too slow, especially if they can get a Skrell's Hive down before you have the opportunity to counterspell them. So play versus draw, once again, kind of playing an important part on whether or not No More Lies is performing well. So at the end here, I like to go over my overall impressions. Sometimes, some of my comments will range to thoughts personally for climbing the best of 3 ladder on Arena, because I don't really play in the standard challenge or really compete in the best of 3 tournament scene, although maybe I should. But we can see here that the reason why everybody decided to cut the 4 copies of Wedding Announcement is it's a reasonable one to take out. Not only is there sideboard hate like Destroy Evil that's coming in to attack the enchantments specifically, but Wedding Announcement, it was really only in the top 8 for Esper Midrange. Notably, I do try to cover 8 archetypes in it. You may have noticed that I only covered 7, and that was because number 8 is Dimir Control. And Dimir Control is an archetype that we saw at the very end of Murders at Karlov Manor, and we still don't have enough data for that matchup. So hopefully as time goes on, we'll see maybe it drops off and, won't have to be covered. I'll cover it once we have enough data for it, right? It's one of those that I've been anticipating growing in popularity, but it kind of depends on how the meta shakes up from Outlaws of Thunder Junction. So maybe further into OTJ, we'll be able to grab some data. So I'll keep my eye on it. The next card on the chopping block after Wedding Announcement is No More Lies. I do think that it was near the bottom in a lot of the matchups, and I'm not 100% sold that it's actually better than Make Disappear, just because of the more difficult to casting cost, and when Esper Midrange needs to have the counterspell. It's, if you're coming up against a bunch of Azorius control and like trying to protect your board from Sunfalls and whatnot, then No More Lies is fine. And the fact that it exiles instead of going to the graveyard is better for like Memory Deluge. But in the best of 3 scene, we've seen Azorius control kind of disappear, kind of fall off the map. So I think I would play around with the idea of replacing the No More Lies with Make Disappear and just see how it goes. But again, that's just kind of a personal thing. So um, maybe as time goes on, we're going to see less copies of No More Lies in future builds as well. Something to consider. The weakest sideboard option, in my opinion, is Duress. I know some of them, some of the meta decks that I was covering on Monday decided to lean full into the 4 copies of Duress, and I think that it's kind of like, at least for climbing the ladder, it's probably not as impactful as another card. Again, a lot of the sideboard options that these guys bring in, they're all really good Magic the Gathering players. They know exactly what they're doing. The reason why they're bringing in Duress, for example, is like you could bring in 2 copies of Duress in against Domain instead of Cut Down, right? Is it going to dramatically improve that win rate? Maybe not. Maybe it's a marginal increase, but it's probably better than just running the Cut Down that is largely a dead card, right? And so similarly, like, so Duress has more of an application specifically to if you're trying to practice for a anticipated matchup, less so for climbing the ladder. So if you're climbing the ladder, I think I would take the Duress out from the sideboard and replace it potentially with like a Long Goodbye. I think that one was looking particularly interesting. Or just bringing back in 2 copies of the Wandering Emperor. There were some matchups where the Wandering Emperor was in the top 10, and it would be nice to have. So, again, that one depends on what you're trying to do with the deck, right? So I hope that's helpful. And if you've made it to this point, thank you very much for listening to my ramblings. And I know my presentation could use a little bit of work, but I do my best. And let me know what's been working for you and what you think. I think that, there's been some really good comments about what, where the data kind of messed up and like where you like to go with a different strategy. And the whole point of this is to create a discussion about understanding the archetype in more detail. So anything that you would like to share about what has worked well for you, or take ways that you've taken the archetype, I would love to hear from you. And I think others in the community would love to hear from you as well. So sideboards always make interesting discussions, and I've decided not to put a vote up for the next sideboard that I will cover, just because I have access to the data and I have a better idea of like what will make a good sideboard guide and what might just be not so great. And I think what I'll do is I'll just kind of march down the list of the most common decks that are happening in the best of 3 tournament scene, where I think this is probably the most useful resource. So if you do have an archetype that you would really like to see and you're just like dying to know, let me know in the comments below, and I will do my best to make the next sideboard guide that. So I do really appreciate everybody taking the time to listen to my ramblings and try to help my dream come true. I do want to do this full time, and nerd out about Magic full time is the dream, right? And you guys are helping me make that come true. So thank you so much for the support. Good luck crushing your matches and RCQs, and I'll see you next week.